You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm glad you're back with me, and I hope you've enjoyed the program so far. As I've said before, I did not do recordings for the Haftarah of the feasts, so if you are wondering, they're not there, so there's no need to look for them. Also, the Haftarah for Noach, for those who may have not noticed, is actually the same Haftarah as out of the ones we read several weeks ago, and therefore I didn't really see a point in making another episode which basically will cover the exact same chapter and the exact same verses. So Noach is basically the same as the Haftarah of Ki Tetzeh. So I basically kept both. I basically put both Haftarot in the same recording and just left it as is. So if you are wondering if something's missing or something like that, then you're not missing anything. It's just I decided not to do a unique one just for something that's already been read before. So that's just a quick update. The other thing as well is that by this point, it is important to realize that many of the Haftarot actually come from the book of Isaiah. And what that means is that there's an ongoing theme that you can actually notice with many of the Haftarot, where many of them are actually taken, the last couple of weeks are all taken from Isaiah, from Yeshayahu. And really when you look at the list, and I'm actually looking at the list right now, the number of Haftarot from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, is actually extremely high. Though we have Haftarot from all over the place, I think Yeshayahu really takes the largest position in all the Haftarot. And this is actually not a very surprising thing, because the Haftarot are also here to create encouragement, and not only just to touch on something that we read in the Torah portion. I did point out, and I did demonstrate this in one of the other recordings, in regards to how the Haftarot came to be. But what's really interesting is really when you look at the statistics, though there are Haftarot from everywhere, Yeshayahu really does take a large number inside the Haftarot percentage-wise, because he's a lot about encouragement, which is what people need and what people needed back also in the day when the Haftarot were introduced, as part of the struggle that they were having with the Roman Empire. So the words themselves basically project into the future as well, later into the future, and so on. Now, before I even begin this, there's a really interesting thing that has to be discussed, which is, how do you understand metaphors? People ask about this all the time. Now, as far as I know, many years ago, a man called Bullinger came out with a book which tried to kind of like explain the way the biblical text is written, and try to go into this whole idea of metaphors and idioms. And it's a very famous book. And what he tried to do there is take the symbols and the ideas and the language of the symbolic and the symbolic language and the metaphors into what an English speaker might understand. Now, surprisingly, because the Hebrew Bible was translated into different languages, especially in Europe, because there's the Ethiopian Bible, for example, which is written in Ge'ez, which is a language that's not really spoken anymore, but it's a Semitic language. But that's a unique situation. The Bible for many centuries was mostly known as something in Europe. The Ethiopian Bible is not a very good example of the Bible, though some people try to promote the idea it's the oldest Bible we have, with the most complete and so on. But it actually contains many books that were completely rejected, that everyone knew were pseudo books, and what we end up with is a Bible that's constructed from a lot of things that are not necessarily really should be considered the Bible, even though the discussion of what actually got into the Bible is a really interesting one by itself. But the thing that we have is that the Bible was translated into European languages for a very long time. So you do have a lot of the language of the Bible in the languages of Europe. So even English sometimes has idioms that are very closely associated with the Hebrew idioms that we would use. And I have this a lot with students. For those who don't know, I teach biblical Hebrew, and I might even expand this into biblical Aramaic and some other languages as well. And if you are interested, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net. That's where you can also listen to all these programs if you don't use iTunes or YouTube and stuff like that. You can go there. All the programs are there. You don't have to start messing around with searching and something doesn't exist and so on. They're all there. And also you can click the donate button if you want to support this podcast. And you can go in there, see what I do right now. Mostly what I'm doing is biblical Hebrew. I have a Bible group, but I'm going to try to expand this very, very soon. And what happens, going back to the subject, what happens with students is that I might try to explain an idiom or a metaphor in Hebrew, and I'll say, well, English has something very similar to this. And it's no surprise because English is technically a European language, even though the British kind of see themselves as part of Europe, but also don't. But a lot of this language continued on because Hebrew uses to this very day a lot of statements that we derive from biblical language, and basically modern Hebrew is another stage in biblical Hebrew. If you look at the series, it's basically you have classic, which concludes early stage of Hebrew all the way into Mishnaic Hebrew. Then you have medieval Hebrew or Middle Hebrew, which is what was mostly used as written language during medieval times, up to around the 1800s, 1900s, and then we have modern Hebrew, which was constructed with principles of the European languages. This is why modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew are actually not really the same, though they share a lot of principles. That are some fundamental things that have been changed. Now, the thing that is very, very surprising is that when you sit down and try to explain to someone the principles of idiomatic language in the Bible, it gets very, very, very fuzzy. And the reason it gets very, very fuzzy actually has an historical background to it. During the Second Temple, people were reading into texts things which were not really in the text. This is what we sometimes call very early stages of Midrash. But this type of reading stems from something that happened more in the Greek world. One of the things that happens with the Greeks is that they wrote down a lot of stories. There are many, many, many stories. Very famous one that we have to learn here in Israel when you learn literature and overall, because we do Hebrew literature, but we also have some elements of foreign literature just for good measure. And for example, there's a very famous story called the story of Antigona. Maybe in English you pronounce it differently, but in Hebrew, called Antigona, and that's actually closer to the Greek pronunciation. And when you learn this story, you're really learning a metaphor about something, about human suffering, about the crisis in life, and so on. And many of the Greeks, especially the Greek philosophers, looked at many of these stories, including stories about gods, so myths and so on, more as metaphors, and you have to read into the stories, into the ideas, what it actually reflects about real life. Now, unfortunately, people were started doing this with the Bible as well, where even today, in a lot of Bible scholar circles, they try to argue that, for example, the story of Joseph is a story, the cycle story of Joseph, which is mostly the focus on Joseph in Egypt, is a novel. And I actually just read something about this, and novels only showed up around the 14th century. So there's a lot of projection of ideas, we can say modern ideas, into the Bible, and we have the same idea very, very early on. By the way, this idea of projecting modern interpretation or modern tools of reading text into the Bible is, I would even call it a sin, because what it does is that it completely ignores context, it completely ignores the ideas behind the Bible, and it actually tries to push the Bible into fable and myth and so on, even though the people who wrote these things never perceived it this way. And sometimes when scholars compare a fable or a story to things in the Bible, they have to catch it. They have to really try to hook this on really, really small hooks when you dig deeper into how how material is described. Like, for example, I just read lately a claim about the book of Joshua and the conquest of Joshua is probably all fake. But when you look at the way kings described their conquest, it's very similar to how it's described in Joshua. So there's a problem overall in how scholars are trying to read certain parts of the Bible and how they are deliberately interpreting things. We have the same problem with other parts of the Tanakh, especially with prophecies and so on, when you try to read idioms and metaphors and so on. The problem was that the Greeks were reading it this way. By the 4th century BCE and the 3rd century BCE, Hellenistic culture, which includes many elements of Greek thinking and Greek interpretation, spread inside Judea as well. And eventually, by the 2nd and 1st century, especially after the Hasmoneans and so on, we start hearing more and more of midrash, more and more the idea of midrashim. That there were several types. That, for example, there's the pesher, which is more of an attempt to interpret prophecies and fit them into what was going on at the time, recognizing Rome as the enemy or the Greeks as the enemy, and then trying to find the sons of light versus sons of darkness. Though the pesher and the sons of light and sons of darkness are not necessarily from the same group. There's a whole collection of writings that are not necessarily all from the same group. It's incorrect to make that argument. But what we do find is a reality where people were taking verses and interpreting them outside of their context and even spiritualizing them. So this actually all starts inside Judaism. Later on, when Christianity came into existence, and Christianity, and again, I know a lot of people are going to argue, well, it wasn't called Christianity in the beginning. I understand and I agree, but we need to understand that we're kind of like jumping ahead very, very quickly, basically into the church fathers, and they were trying to prove certain elements of belief by reading the biblical text and ignoring the overall idea of what's actually being said and what the historical context is. Now, if you read a verse and use it as an anchor for an idea that's really there mostly to use the verse as a gateway into a discussion, where you start off with a verse that everyone could recognize, which is, by the way, what rabbis did in the Midrashim. If you ever read, for example, a Midrash Tanchuma, also known as Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, may our rabbi teach us, they start with a verse and they kind of play with the verse, try to keep into the meaning of the verse, and then they flow into something else. That's one thing. All you're doing is you're creating an anchor that everyone could recognize, and then when people try to remember what the rabbi said, all they have to do is start from the verse, and then the material will run in their head. They'll remember everything the rabbi said. However, in Christianity, what happened is metaphor and literal meaning got jumbled up together to a point where the difference between a metaphor and an actual statement, a statement of reality, got completely mixed together to a point where people sometimes have discussions about meanings of words and meanings of verses completely and utterly outside of what the text is really talking about. So people commonly ask, and this is a very common question, a lot of places, and I have friends who deal with this as well, they ask, how do I know the difference between a metaphor and a literal meaning? Well, there are several things. First of all, obviously, context. If your description is talking about, the heavens being iron and the earth being copper, it's not that the heavens going to be made of iron and the earth is going to be made of copper. Okay, what it means is that the heavens are not going to give rain and the earth is not going to produce produce. So there is a way of recognizing these things. The major problem that you have is sometimes with words that have, especially inside certain Jewish and Christian circles, have unique meaning. So, for example, just a couple of days ago, someone contacted me asking me about the word seed. Can seed mean anything outside of, something that reproduces? A seed of a tree, a seed of a plant, or a seed of a human? And the problem is that because the term seed and the idea of child and genealogy and descent, being a descent of someone, became very, very tainted very, very early on. I mentioned the war of the sons of light versus sons of darkness. They identified that there are people who are inherently born of a certain creed of people who are evil or are good, or that they are spiritual descendants of a certain group. Like, for example, there's this idea of the descendants of the Nephilim are usually wicked people, and you can't identify them in the street because they don't look like giants anymore and stuff like that. These are interpretations that really came into existence because of an attempt to try to explain the spiritual reality of the time. Even today, when you see a secular person doing something wicked, they start talking about he must be from the seed of the snake or something like that, or for example, we hear this in Jewish circles. They're not really descendants of actual Jews, or you hear with Christians they're not a real Christian and stuff like that. These are all spiritual interpretations that attempt to explain the reality of what's going on. Why is there evil? Why are good people dying? Why are wicked people succeeding, and so on? And asking these questions and trying to interpret it, and basically saying, well, it's really, the idea is that they're doing this and it protects them. Like, for example, there's this massive discussion was going on in the Second Temple of, we see this wicked person, but they're keeping Torah, but I perceive them as being wicked, so I must explain that there's some spiritual reason why this is going on, which, by the way, led to a massive birth of the idea of Satan and Belial. There's actually 4 Satans in the Dead Sea Scrolls, if I remember correctly. And what it leads to is exiting the world of reality and exiting the world of actual literal meaning, and then going into spiritual interpretations of things. So it's very important to understand that the way you identify the difference between a metaphor and literal meaning is, first of all, pay attention to the overall context. Look if it's something possible or impossible. Again, as I said, something which is not realistic, like talking about monsters, or talking about fire falling from the sky in midday. That actually can be literal because we have the story of Joshua, but sometimes the context might indicate something much more metaphoric, much more of a picture of an idea, and less the idea of actually something literal happening. So, for example, there's this whole discussion about the blood moons. The prophet Yoel talks about that the moon will become blood. So every time there's a blood moon, which is actually quite a common occurrence, everyone goes bananas. But when you actually read the whole idea, and you follow the principles of what darkness represents, when the moon goes red, it means that there's a lunar eclipse. Okay, actually, you can have a lunar eclipse that doesn't go completely red, and then the lunar eclipse is where it does go red, and it depends what kind of eclipse you're having. But this is actually quite a common occurrence, and everyone really goes nuts. In the last, I think, since 2016, 2015, there's been a lot of discussion about these blood moons, and so on. But really, it's been emphasized because someone started emphasizing it. If you actually know anything about how it works, this happens on a much more common basis than people realize. So, what does it mean? The everything will go black, and the sun will vanish, and the sun will become darkness, and the moon become blood, and so on. It's a metaphor of darkness. When we talk about someone being in darkness, or they're in a dark place, they're not necessarily sitting in a dark room. We're talking about the idea of just being in a state of darkness. Like, for example, during the Second World War, it was a dark time. Okay, think about the term dark time. Everyone immediately knows that doesn't mean that there's darkness outside. We're not talking about the plagues of Egypt. We're talking about, it's not a good time for us. By the way, you can argue that, as some scholars would go, say, well, it went dark in Egypt, and it wasn't that really it was dark. It was a bad time for them. But again, you can see the difference. The plagues are describing something realistic. They're inside a realistic structure. While when you're reading things like prophecy, or you're reading books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and actually Ecclesiastes at the end uses a lot of metaphors to describe old age. He's using these words that cannot really be literal about a human being. So you have to pay attention to what is the book that you're reading. Does this type of book have a tendency to use metaphors? Do you look into the metaphor itself, see if it can have a realistic implication, or if it's outside of reality, then maybe it means something different. But obviously, to really explain this, you have to go over many, 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 many examples. But that's really the basis of everything. What kind of book are you reading? Does it have a realistic context? Can the words have, if it's, for example, a specific individual like the word seed, that comes up a lot in discussions. I had it literally a couple of days ago, someone brought it up, but it's something that is is very, very common in discussions between different people and different groups and so on. Can the word have a metaphoric meaning, or is this word always used in a literal meaning? If it can be used as a metaphor, does the text itself, does the context of the text enable a metaphoric meaning, or does it force itself into something in reality? And again, if you're talking about prophecy, talking about the plains, the mountains becoming plains and so on, we read this in the book of Isaiah. Is it possible? It's not really talking about mountains will flatten down. It means that it will be easy to get from place to place. The returners to Zion won't be too difficult for them to travel from place to place and so on. You have these problems. These are well-known problems with text, but there are ways to work around it if you follow these basic rules. Now, the reason I bring this up, besides the fact that it's something that came up, is in the Yemenite tradition, they actually have, they start reading from a much earlier point, and the prophet does talk about the idea of comparing and metaphors and using language like that. And he actually starts off from verse 25, Isaiah 40, verse 25. That's what the Yemenites start reading. So I want to start from there, and our reading goes all the way to Isaiah 41, verse 16. And he starts off and he says, "Ve'elmite dimayuni va'ashave," to whom you will imagine me and I will compare. The word dimayon from the root dama means to find similarity and so on. So you use a metaphor, an idiom or something to give a person an idea of what exactly they're looking at, and maybe talking about it's like this. For example, talking about God in God's hands and feet and so on. Maimonides, for example, argues that it is more of a metaphor, though, for example, Dr. Ben Somer argues that no, it's not a metaphor. The Israelites did believe that God had a form. Now, it's a really interesting debate. So Ben Somer is a scholar. Maimonides is more of a scholar in the philosophy point of view. And he asks himself the question, well, how can they disagree on this? Well, very, very simple. Ben Somer is trying to compare the Israelite culture to the ancient Near East, and he says, well, in the ancient Near East, they describe their gods as actual large human beings. Now, we don't really know if they believe this was a literal way they looked, the form of the god, or this was just a metaphor that they use, and so on. There's a bit of a debate over that. But, for example, Maimonides argues, no, these are all metaphors, because he actually comes from a background that discusses the idea of complete abstract monotheism, which stems from the discussions with Islam, because Islam believes in complete abstract God, and there was even a group that argued that if you say anything about God, you're a heretic. Now, this is, again, going back to this subject of metaphors. How do you actually read a text? So Ben Somer comes from his direction. By the way, it's a very, very interesting book. It's called, I think, The Bodies of God or something like that. And there's 4 lectures you can find online where he discusses his book. And Maimonides, who comes from a very, very specific point of view of complete abstract thought. Now, Isaiah, for example, is almost an absolute monotheist. He has places where it looks as if he is talking about God in a certain manner of there's some kind of a form-ish, but we do find, for example, in Deuteronomy, and Isaiah and Deuteronomy are closely linked to one another in the mind of many, many scholars, and therefore Isaiah, it's much easier to say he's much more monotheistic. But again, what do you do with these metaphors? What do you do with these descriptions? Are these actual metaphors, or are these things which are supposed to represent reality? The same thing, the hand of God. That's always been a famous discussion. The hand of God. Why does it say the hand of God? Well, you have to understand, hand is representation of strength and power, and therefore it's not necessarily really the hand. It wasn't as if a hand came out and did something, but there probably were and are people who do believe that there's a form because of this type of wording. So the prophet actually asked this really interesting question, and he's speaking as the voice of God, and he says, to whom you will imagine me, and I will be compared. Yomar Kadosh will say the Holy One. Kadosh is a term he actually uses. Isaiah uses quite a bit to describe God, Kadosh Israel, and so on. Now, the question itself stems from the idea that Isaiah is battling the the pagan ideology of the period, whether it's Assyria or Babylon, and he's actually attacking and tackling many of the creation stories that we actually have from the ancient Near East. And he is pointing out, as I've explained before, he's pointing out that God is the creator of everything. So he says, there really is nothing out there that you can compare me to. But again, if you, for example, take the approach that this is not necessarily talking about if God has a form or not, and it's more about, is there any other power out there besides me? So again, there's a question here of the nature of the exact question. Is he asking comparison to something physical, or is he asking comparison of strength and power and ability? So the answer actually comes to the next verse, which says, Se'u marom einechem ur'u mi vara ele, lift up your eyes to the heavens, or marom really means up, which in this case means heavens, and see who created all of these. Hamotzivim mispar tzevaam, who brings out by number, and also probably means knowing their numbers, the host, which really refers to the stars. Lechulam b'shem mikra, to all of them he will call by name. He has complete knowledge of the cosmos. Merov onim v'amitz koach, from the great strength and the outburst of force that he has. Ish lo ne'edar, none of them are missing. He knows everyone. So it's talking more about the idea of strength, power, ability, control of the universe. He said, you look at all the stars in the heaven, they're all far away. God says, even those things which are far, far, far away from everything, I know exactly who they are. I know exactly what they're called. I know all of them, which, by the way, might indicate the idea that what we see is not everything. And today, with the advent of telescopes and so on, we actually know that there are more stars out there. So when you think about it, it's even greater. Unless you're a flat earther, and then it's a completely different discussion. But the whole idea is that God is basically presenting himself as the ultimate power that knows everything about everything, because he is pointing out there is no competition. He's saying there is no competition. You can't compare me to anyone. You can't compare me to anything. But the focus here is not about physical versus non-physical or anything like that. It's more about strength and power. So again, reading things in context gives you an idea of who he is. So this is not necessarily an absolutist monotheistic description about God's nature. It's more about saying there's God, and then there's all the other stuff that people claim about other things in the universe, which are completely wrong. So God says here, I know everything, I control everything, and therefore he asks a very, very simple question. Lama tomar Yaakov v'tedaber Yisrael? Why do you say Jacob and you will speak Israel? Nistera darki ma'Adonai u'melohai mishpati avo. Why? So why do you say this? That my ways are hidden from the Lord, and from my God, my judgment, my state, my needs. It's for a true judge, for a protector judge, basically passes on. He doesn't even pay attention to it. So he says, Halo yadata im lo shamata, for it is that you know, if not that you have heard. If you have not heard, Elohei olam Adonai borei ketzot haaretz, the Lord, the eternal Lord, because olam means forever. In latter Hebrew it translates, and I think I explained this before, in latter Hebrew it translates as universe, but here the word olam in biblical Hebrew means long time or eternal. So he is the eternal God, the Lord creator of the ends of the earth. Now the term ketzot haaretz, that's, for example, a really good example of a metaphor. Ketzot haaretz, the ends of the earth. So yes, in the ancient world they actually did believe that the earth was flat. There's no doubt about it. This is how every cosmological description that we have, except for the Greeks actually believed the earth was round. I've seen people try to argue the opposite. It's not true. The Greeks, even in this period of Isaiah, believed the earth was round. And I actually had a discussion with one of my professors, Dr. Peleg, where we discussed this subject, and she said, no, it's very obvious we know, because, and she actually eventually, not her, but I was taken by one of my other professors. We were going on a field trip for archaeology, and we were shown Greek statues, very early stage Greek statues in the land of Israel, and you could see a round earth. And we're talking way before the Hellenistic period. We're talking about people who were borderline Philistines, but they were already more and more Greek. But in any case, ketzot haaretz, the ends of the earth. So is this a metaphor or is this literal? Now, today, that most people believe the earth is round, we take this as a metaphor. But it could be that at this time they literally believed that, there's an end somewhere at the end of the world, and, God will gather from there. So again, could be a literal meaning, but today we will take it, and people who believe the earth is round would take this more as a metaphoric sense of meaning everywhere. So this is actually an example of culture versus modern day knowledge and how it actually influences how we understand. But if you want to have the actual cultural meaning of the time, then Ketzot ha'aretz means the ends of the earth, which means the earth does have an end. Lo ya'af v'lo yega, he will not weary and he will be tired and will not be weary. En heker letvunato, there is no end, there is no ability to search, because the word heker means from the word hakar, to search, to look into. There is no search to his knowledge. Noten laya'ef koch. So he says now, he knows everything, he controls everything, he knows all the stars. Basically, there's no stopping him. He is the ultimate power. So he then states and says, Noten laya'ef koch v'le'en onim otzma yarbe. He gives the weary strength, and to he who has no, the word on means physical strength. It's usually something that's also related to masculinity and so on. For those who do not have force or strength, onim otzma yarbe, he increases their force, he increases their ability. So he's pointing out and saying, listen, you're in a bad state right now, but you have nothing to fear. I have the ability to bring you back up, and when the time is right, it will happen. There's an issue here of sit and wait. Wait for him. Don't start throwing out a tantrum the moment something doesn't work for you. It doesn't happen now, which is counter to the culture, for example, the massive culture growing today of the instant gratification, where everyone's looking for everything now, instead of saying, well, wait a little bit. For example, if you're a responsible parent, you can look at your child and say, well, here's a possibility. You can either have this 1 shekel right now, or if you wait a couple days, I will give you 5. And I've done this experiment with my kids. The older the kids get, or the more mature the kids are, because age and maturity are not necessarily equal. There's no graph that they grow simultaneously. Sometimes the age can grow and the graph for maturity actually stays static. But the more mature an older a child is, the better they understand it's worthwhile waiting. But today everything is instant gratification. I actually had my own experiences, for example, with students and clients that they wanted to know now immediately. So they fell for these. They fell for these promises of learn Hebrew in 10 days and stuff like that, which no one learns Hebrew that quickly, especially a version of Hebrew is not spoken on an everyday basis. For example, I have to take Akkadian as one of the languages that I need to know, and the thing that I discovered was that I actually have to take 4 hours every week for the next year. Okay, for the next school year, 4 hours every week of Akkadian, not including self-study at home and exercising and so on. So we're talking about a lot of hours. Now, Akkadian, granted, is a difficult language, way more difficult than Hebrew, but still, it gives you an idea of how long it actually takes to learn a dead language. So going back to our text, he's telling the people, sit and wait. It's going to happen. I have the ability to do it. Have hope. And this is something I've emphasized with Isaiah all the time. He's the prophet of hope. Almost everything he talks about is about hope. But he doesn't start, when he has to criticize, he does. So he's kind of like telling hope, but I was also criticizing the mentality. Oh, you think these other gods are strong? Well, wait to see what I can do. And lo and behold, 2,500 years later, those gods and cultures don't exist anymore. The God of Israel is still around, and people still believe in him, and the belief in him has even become worldwide. There are many, many, many people everywhere on the earth who believe in the God of Israel. Granted, there's some variations which can be questionable, but the core idea is actually there. People go around saying the Bible is our book. That's pretty astonishing. So then he goes and he says, V'ya'afu ne'arim v'yigaw, and this is on the opposite, those who are young, those who are strapping, those who are strong. And this can also be, again, a metaphor to the new gods, all these different Babylonian gods and everything, versus the actual real God of all eternity, who's been around forever and ever and ever, from time immemorial to an existence that human beings can't even comprehend. And he says, these young ones, so he's talking about as a literal meaning, saying an old person, I can make them run like a gazelle, and a young person could be sluggish like a rock. And that's my power. I can give anyone anything. But you can also say this is a metaphor talking about these other gods that they're talking about, these young, strapping gods, everyone's the new popular gods, the new popular religions, and so on. It says these young ones will become tired and they will become weary. Uvachorim kashori kashelu, and those who are young, bachur is a young man, a strapping young man in his 20s or something, will fail, will completely fail. But then he says in verse 31, Vekove Adonai yachalifu choach. But those who hope to the Lord, and I actually a couple weeks ago I actually wrote about the word tikva, which from the same root, which means hope, always giving hope. Hope is a massive gift that the Almighty has given mankind because it helps us push forward, go forward, succeed and do things, even in situations which seem to be hopeless. So he actually says they will replace their strength, they will increase their strength, they will replace the strength and become youthful again. Ya'alu ever kanesharim, and they will lift up ever. Ever is another word for wing, like the eagles. Now this is obviously a metaphor. Human beings don't sprout wings. It's just a reality. But he's talking about the ability to fly, the ability to move very, very quickly. This was actually something very common in metaphors in the ancient world, or also the imagery of angels. Why are angels described as having wings? Well, there's a very, very simple reason, because you can think about, for example, Superman or any one of these superheroes. They fly around without wings, except for maybe one character that appears in X-Men. Yes, I grew up a time where X-Men was very, very popular back in the 90s, and there used to be the cartoons and everything. Remember, there was always this funny thing that I always asked the question of, well, I can understand why they have a character with wings and they called him Angel, because they're playing off of, old culture and everything, but most superheroes fly without wings. Well, the thing is that in the ancient world, they perceived the idea of birds being able to escape, to fly away, to distance themselves from an enemy very, very, very fast. So wings were considered to be a symbol of speed. Same way horns, for example, were in the ancient world seen to be a symbol of strength and power and authority. Wings were a symbol of speed, of moving quickly. A quick messenger has wings. For example, one of the Greek gods has wings on his shoes. I can't remember which one it was. It's because this is what the thing symbolized. But this is obviously a metaphor. Human beings don't have wings. The metaphor is a metaphor of speed. They're going to increase their strength and they're going to be able to be very, very fast. It says, Yerutzu v'lo yigau, they will run and not become weary. Now that's obviously not a metaphor. This is literal. The person will run and they will have a lot of strength to be able to succeed. Yelchu v'lo ya'afu, they will walk and not become tired. So then the prophet moves on to another point, but there's a linking word, which is again the principle of strength. There's a linking principle here. So he carries on here into a different section, and he says, so he calls out and he says that the islands, which can be either people who live in a distance. We've actually seen Isaiah this idea of moving from the east to the west, and when he talks about the west, it's really usually the islands. So he's talking about those who might be exiled to the islands and so on. He says, be silent to me so you can actually hear what I'm actually the judgment I'm going to pass on to you. And the nations will replace their strength. So, and some of the commentaries say so they can stand in trial. They will draw near. Nagash appears as a legal term. So this is yigashu. This is a form of the verb from the root nagash, which means to draw near, usually in a trial sense. So they will draw near, az yedaberu, then they will speak, yahdav lemishpat nikreva. So he says, together we will draw near to the trial. And he says, mihi'ir mimizrach tzedek yikreu leraglo, who awakens from the east justice will call it to his feet. To call to one's feet is usually for them to be present before them. Now, there's a bit of a question here who exactly this tzedek is, but if it's a someone or something, but you can actually say that tzedek here might actually mean the one who brings justice. But the question is, how does he bring the justice? So some understand this as being The one who brings justice is a righteous king, and in the traditional interpretation of the, not traditional, but the classic interpretation of Bible scholarship, this is actually Cyrus, and because they argue that the second half of Isaiah has many elements that come from an earlier stage of a latter stage of Judean history, and this is actually one who brings justice from the east. That will be Cyrus, and he calls him before his feet. And he says, "Yiten lefanav goim umlachim yard." He will place before him nations and kings he will rule over. Yiten ka'afar charbo. He will place his sword like the dirt of the earth, which means more that the enemies will fall and become like the dirt of the earth. Kikashni daf kashto, and his arrows will make the nations like straw, the dry straw that flies in the wind. Now, this is already talking about someone who's going to do this. Someone is actually going to be involved in doing this. The question is, if we read this not being Cyrus, then who would it be? Well, we can also have the whole idea of God being presented, like for example, from the Haftarah that I read from my bar mitzvah, God is described as being one who wages war against the Edomites. So that can be something that might be the metaphor here. So then he carries on. He says, "Yirdefem ya'avor shalom." He will chase them, and anywhere he passes through, he will pass in peace. And there's actually an interesting. There's an Akkadian expression, "Shalamish eteku," which basically means to pass in peace, which means no one can actually stop him. So there's some force here, either Cyrus or some other force that's going through. He is the judgment of the nations. God said, "Listen to me, hear the judgment." The judgment of the nation is something from the east. Now, again, we have to remember that we do have the description in Deuteronomy 32 and 33. I'll actually give you the exact verse, but it describes as God appearing from the east. Okay, if we actually go there, he says, it says, chapter 33, verse 2, it says, Vayomar, and he said, Adonai mi Sinai ba vezarach meseir lamo. So the Lord came at Sinai, glowed from Seir for them, probably his people. Hofia mehar Paran, he appeared from the mountain of Paran, ve'ata mirvevot Kodesh, and it appeared from the multitude of Kodesh. Now, Sinai and especially Seir, these are all east of the land of Israel. So there's an idea here of God appearing from the east and then from there carrying on. But also God uses messengers. So this can be a righteous king who's going to do God's will. But in any case, it says it carries on. It says you pass in peace. Orach beraglav lo yavo. So nothing will come before his feet. There are no obstacles in his feet. And therefore he can carry on straight. So then he asks again, clearly he says, Mi fa'al ve'asa, who acted and did? And he answers, Koreh hadorot merosh, he who calls the generations from in advance, the one who actually has the ability to know the future, which was considered to be something that only only a divine power can do this. Now, there's an interesting answer. The answer itself is really, really interesting, because what he's basically saying is saying you can give any political, geopolitical, whatever, economic issue that might be the physical trigger to a situation, but he says that person who's going to show up from the east, he's showing up because God wants it. Which means that the books of prophecy understand the problems that people have in seeing certain things. And he says, yes, you can interpret this as a geopolitical situation. This group rebelled, which brought forth this king who did this and that action. But then you have to ask yourself your question, well, didn't God say this is going to happen as well? Acting inside the structure, the prophet is very aware of this. They didn't live in a fantasy world. They actually lived in the real physical world. They understood these problems. People had to go to work every day. People had to do a lot of things. Many of us, remember, for many years, grow up with this idea, especially if you come from religious backgrounds, you read the Bible and you want to be part of it and everything, but we completely forget that this was actually in the real physical world and these things actually happened. And the prophet, and as I've explained before in the past, the prophet is dealing with actual debates and discussions that people are having. Now, if we take the Cyrus interpretation, Korash, as we call him in Hebrew, though his name was actually a lot more complex than Cyrus or Korash, the thing that basically happens is that people were debating, is this really the salvation we're looking for? It's like the argument about the state of Israel. Is this really the beginning of our salvation, or is it something else? Well, I would say some of it depends on us. If we treat it as such and we promote what we're supposed to do as an Israelite nation and promote the keeping of Torah and the identity of Torah and the identity of us as a nation in the land, then yes, this can be our salvation. It really depends a lot on us as well. But eventually God will say, well, I'm fed up. I'm just going to force this on you. There's actually, I think in Ezekiel, he actually says, I will do it for my name's sake, which means I don't care what you're going to do, I'm going to still force it, which leads into a lot of end of day scenarios that people believe will happen. That's a whole discussion by itself. So he says, who acted and did? He who calls who calls the generations from the beginning. Ani Adonai Rishon v'Acharonim hu. Ani hu. I am the Lord who is first, and I am with the last ones. I am He. Ani hu at the end really emphasizes who He is, because there's an issue here. There's an important issue here of focusing and forcing and saying, I am the one doing all of this. And the first and the last appear the first generations and the last, or He is the first, and then he's talking about to the last generations. So he says, the islands will see and fear. Ketzot haaretz ve'cherado. So ketzot here probably means the other end. So if the islands are in the west, then we're talking about the east, or all other directions. Because remember, back then, there were areas they were completely unaware of, like for example, Western Europe, England, all these places, Germany, were completely unknown to them. The world was much, much, much smaller back then, and beyond the desert of the Sahara Desert, and so they didn't know any of these places. It took centuries later until they actually started discovering these places. So he's talking about the east and then the west, and they have parts in the north, but there were areas where these gigantic mountains that they thought, well, that's one of the barriers to the world. And you can't go beyond these mountains. This also fits into the overall perspective of how the world worked back then. So he says, the islands will see and fear, the ends of the earth will quiver, karvu v'yatayun, they will draw near, and yatayun also means from the root atat, to come. So they basically means they draw near. But he's saying, all of you have to come near and hear the judgment, hear the trial that I'm coming into. So what is the actual trial here? Well, the trial here is a trial of force. Who is the real God? So he says, and he describes it, what they're doing. Ish et re'o ya'azor, each man helps his friend. U'le'achiv yomar chazak, and to his brother he says strong. Now they're doing something together. And he explains in verse 7, Ve'yachazek harash et soref, a woodworker strengthens the metal worker. Mahalik patish et holem pam, he who smooths out or passes the hammer smoothly over the one who strike once. Because actually, if you see how they used to do metalwork with hammers, there sometimes would do work with two hammers, and sometimes one hammer will actually give the strong strike, and then another hammer will give something a little softer. That's at least how some people understand it. So we have the mahlik patish et holem pam, the one who passes the hammer versus the one who strikes once. Now, it might be that there's something else being said here, but basically we're looking at they're creating something, they're making something through metalwork, through woodwork, and this is usually connected to actually idol worship. And he says, Omer ladevek tovhu, he who says to the glue, it is good, ve'chazekeo ve'masmerim lo yimot, and he strengthens it with nails, for it won't fall over, it won't fall to pieces. He's actually saying, I am going to trial you nations for your idol worshipping. You have to ask yourself a question. Well, the nations are not commanded to to worship the God of Israel. I mean, it depends. There's some people who do argue that they are, because the God of Israel is still the God of all creation and everything, and because Isaiah does have a universal idea in how he describes it, the trial here is more about proving who God is and not really trialing the people for idol worshiping. The moment they recognize that they've made a mistake, then they'll let go of the idols. But he's basically pointing out, like Isaiah does in multiple other places, you have to understand what you're doing is you have humans working really hard making the idols, and then this is suddenly your God. It's a really, really funny comic strip that I saw where there's a man standing in front of a tree. I think it was like a pear tree or something like that. And there's a pear on the tree. But he decides to chop down the tree, make an idol shaped like a pear, and then pray to the idol, which is made of the pear wood, to give him pears. Where instead of just, there's already a tree. Who created that tree? Well, God. So he's pointing the same idea out. He's saying, look, you're taking wood, which I created. You're seeing how the world works in a certain way, and you're trying to override the structure of the world, override the structure of the universe by actively making an idol and then saying, oh, this is my God now, basically Isaiah ridicules them for this. But the point is, as we said earlier, there's an issue here. Who is the real God? Who is the real strength? Who has the real abilities? And Isaiah is pointing out to this thing, but he's turning to the nations, because you have to remember that Israel, the Judeans in Israel were in servitude, sent to Egypt, North Africa, to Anatolia, to almost Greece, to the east. And he said, all these gods, all these idols, they all claim their gods are the strongest. And he says, no, I'm going to gather all of you. You're going to see who the real God is of this little nation, this small group of people who are the only ones who actually have the truth. And then he turns around and he says, and this is always when I bring this up, it's controversial, and he says, V'ata Yisrael avdi, Yaakov asher bechalticha. Now my Israel, my servant. And last time I spoke about this, I got some negative feedback for some people. But yes, Isaiah identifies more than one servant. There are at least two servants, and there could even be a third servant. But when you read the text as is, you get basically two servants. You have Israel, which is mentioned multiple times, and you have the servant who's the prophet. Again, Isaiah 53 is always the controversial part because everyone wants it to mean something specific, and I think it blindsides everyone on what the text is actually saying. I think that a lot of our religious ideologies, regardless of where we come from, are sometimes blinding us from actually seeing what the text is talking about. So here it's obviously Israel, Jacob. This is the terminology that every text in the Bible uses to describe the actual people. So it says, you Israel, my servant, Yaakov asher bechalticha, Jacob, which I have chosen, Zera Avraham Ohavi, the seed of Abraham, so there's a question, the one who loves me or my beloved? I actually usually translate as the one who loves me, because Ohavi means the one, the direction of the action and so on in the verbal form is active. If it would have been my beloved, it would be Ahuvi with an U sound, not Ohavi with an A sound. So the one who loves me. But it does kind of negate the idea, because my servant, the one I have chosen, then it should be the one that I love. So they might actually be either, you can argue there's because of the context you have to say my beloved, or you can say that because Israel was chosen, then it's from God's end. But then Avraham, the issue with Avraham was that he was actually beloved. He was actually the one who loved God, and this is why God chose him, because he was loyal to God. So we're not talking about Israel, Jacob, which God chose. We're talking about Abraham, the seed of Abraham, and Abraham is presented from a completely different point of view as the one who loved God, which really does fit the verses. But many translations go my beloved because they're looking at the sequence of God acting, then this third one must be acting, but the third one is a different person, and therefore does not necessarily have to fall in the same category. However, what's more important is this term Zera Avraham Ohavi. The term Zera, again, I mentioned the term seed earlier. This is literal seed, because he talks about Israel and Yaakov. These are literal people. Okay, a lot of people try to take this into a metaphorical interpretation, which stems from certain specific religious perspectives, but the literal meaning here is the seed of the ones I chose, the seed of the one who loved me, which is a literal seed. It's the descendants of Abraham. And he says, Asher hechzakticha miktzot haaretz, which I have held you from the ends of the earth, ve'me'atzilea keraticha, and from its the atzilim is really like almost like the folds of the body. Atzilei hayadayim is sometimes what you can call the corners of the body. So these are, again, another way of saying from its corners I have called you. Va'omar lecha avdi ata b'charticha velo ma'asticha. And I said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you, have not repelled you. I do not hate you. Al tira ki immecha ani, and he says, don't fear, for I am with you. Al teshta ki ani Elohecha, do not stall, do not stand there bewildered, for I am your God. Al matzticha af azarticha, I have given you courage or strengthened you, and I have actually helped you. Af tamachticha, and I've given you support. Bimin tzidki, with my right arm of justice, because the right hand again is the symbol of action, but so therefore all actions which are supposed to be justice should be from the right hand, because even today most people are right-handed, but there's this ideology that being right-handed is much better. Today, with all the discussions of equality and everything, people say, well, left, right doesn't really matter. But in the old world, this right hand was the hand of action. This is what you did things with. And then he says, "Hen yevoshu v'yikalemu kol hanecharim bach." So for it is that they will be ashamed, and yevosh and kalmu, yavash and kalam are basically the same thing. So the idea is to say they will be ashamed. It's going to be a case of what's known as a henditis, which is saying the same thing with two different words and connecting them with a conjunctive vav. All those who flare their nostrils at you, and neharim from the word nahar, which is to make a noise through the nostrils. So all those who have flaming nostrils or anger towards you, they will be like nothing, and they will be destroyed. All the people who are your enemies, or all those who argue with it, because the word riv also means an argument, a trial, but also means a physical. So all your attackers will be gone. You will seek them and not find them, the men who argue with you, the men who fight with you. So again, the term matzah is another word to describe an argument, a physical argument or an argument of words. They will be gone as nothing, and they will be as gone and as nothing. Ayin means there's nothing. Ephes means it's a term for zero. So they'll be like nothing and like non-existence. The men of your war, the ones who struggle against you. Ki ani Adonai Elohecha, for I am the Lord your God. Mahzik yaminecha, who holds your right hand. Okay, so the right hand here is pointing out you don't have strength right now, but I'm going to support your right hand so you can do things. Ha'omer lecha al tira ani azartecha, who says to you, do not fear, I am here to help you. And that's really the thing. You're describing a nation that's been exiled, scattered all over the place, and God says, don't worry, I'm going to be there, I'm going to hold you up. So Isaiah, as I said, is always about hope. He's always pointing out the principle of hope. And then he refers the last three verses of this Haftarah, and he says, Al tir'i tola'at Yaakov, do not fear the worm of Israel. Tola'at really does mean worm, or can be something small, a small insect, and so on. Again, this is obviously a metaphor, but he's referring to Israel as a weak, unsustainable, small item eaten by the smallest of all predators, can destroy them. Metei Israel. So Metei Israel, the word Metei, unlike the word Met, which means dead, Metei actually means the people of Israel. There's a problem always with this issue of how to identify a root and what a root actually means, and then you discover that sometimes certain words share roots and they have completely different meanings. So Metei, surprisingly, even though it sounds like the dead ones of Israel, and some might actually argue this, Metei actually means the people of Israel. So he says the worm of Jacob really means which he explained as being the people of Israel. However, it is logical to argue that this is referring to the idea of almost like the dead. If we have the idea of the dry bones, if you can actually argue into this idea that maybe the term here really means the dead ones of Israel, but some people even say that Metei actually might be a reference to some kind of other type of worm or something, though maybe the original word was a little different, and they actually had difficulty with this, because what does it mean? How does the parallel work here? The worm of Israel, the people of it, how does that work? So some versions actually read this differently. So it says, Ani azarticha neum Adonai, Ani azartich neum, and I thought it's in the feminine, no azarticha, but azartich, I have helped you, the word of the Lord, v'go'alech kedosh Yisrael, and your Savior, the Holy One of Israel. So then he actually says, and he says to Israel, Hines samtich lemorag charutz chadash. So I will place you as a threshing sledge. Now, threshing sledge is this large plate, usually made of wood. You rarely see it these days because today we use combines and stuff like that, and they basically do the whole process on the spot. But what they used to have is they would harvest their grain, and then make sheaves, and then take the sheaves and make a pile. But when they wanted to actually separate the seed from the chaff and the stem, they had to spread it down on the ground, and they would take an animal, usually cattle because they're stronger, and they would take this large wooden plate, it's basically rectangular, and had a lot of bumps on the bottom. And they would harness it to an animal. Someone would stand on it and basically get the animal to move. And by putting a human's weight on it, the plate would basically go over all the grain and basically crush it and separate everything. And this is basically what he's describing. I'm going to make you like this threshing sledge. And basically, you're going to be like a new one, which means all the bumps are fresh, everything's strong, everything has force to it, and you would actually destroy your enemies. It says lemorag charutz chadash, to a threshing sledge new with sharp pointed teeth. Charutz is usually something that sticks out. For example, we have this term in Hebrew, lachrotz lashon, or velo yachrotz kelev leshono, which means a dog won't stick out his tongue. So the idea is something sticking out. Ba'al pifiot, who actually has pointed teeth. Now, pifiot usually means sharp from both edges, which means basically something very strong, very new, with a lot of ability. It says, tadush harim v'tadok. You will thresh the mountains, and you will crush them. And usually lidok, it's usually connected to making something into dust. Ugvaot kamotz tasim, and the hills you will reduce or make into chaff. Basically, he's not really talking about mountains and so on. He's actually talking about the enemies, these great mountains, these great hills. And he says tizarem veruach tisaem. But rather using the metaphor of mountains and hills, you have to remember that you make a mount of grain. So he's playing inside that metaphor, still playing inside that metaphor, but he's actually talking about their enemies. It says, Tizerem veruach tisaim, you will fan them. You basically throw it up into the air. If you ever seen, you take a pitchfork and you throw it up in the air, and the chaff flies away and the seed falls down to the ground. And the wind will carry them. V'se'arat tafitz otam, and a storm will scatter them. V'ata tagil ba'Adonai, and you will rejoice in the Lord. B'kdosh Yisrael tithalal, and by the Holy One of Israel, you will be glorified. So he's basically saying you have nothing to worry because God is going to be on your side. He is going to defeat the enemies, but the defeat, and this is really the important thing, is done by the people. It's not completely as God does everything. He sends his messengers. And guys, I hope you enjoyed these recordings. Again, remember, you can go visit HebrewInIsrael.net. If you want to help the recordings, please consider donating, because it does give me the ability to find research material, to travel to places where the research material exists. But in any case, the most important thing is to share and to show your friends and discuss the material, and even disagree. It's perfectly fine. It's part of life. Kol Tov.